Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. A little while ago I discussed the fact that I was moving back to releasing just one video a week because the schedule was just getting too tough to produce the content. What you're going to find over the next couple of months though is that you're generally going to be receiving 2 videos per week here on the channel. And the reason for that is I've got a whole bunch of brand new products coming out that suppliers, retailers have sent me to share with you at the time of the release or as close as possible to it. And this is one of those examples. So today I've pushed this one into the queue and I've got a review for you of the HarmonicDyne Poseidon Headphones. These are being released today. Now depending on time zones, this video may come out just slightly ahead of the actual release. So do make sure you check the link again if it's not live the moment you see this video. Because very soon, if not already, the link that's in the description below will go active and allow you to access an early bird special on the HarmonicDyne Poseidon. I want to say a huge thanks to Linsol for making this review possible. They sent me out both the Poseidon and the Zeus so I could provide this comparison for you, but most importantly, introduce you to the brand new Poseidon headphone. The Poseidon is going to retail for $435 US. It's essentially an update and upgrade, a successor if you like, to the Zeus. As of recording this review, I haven't yet had confirmation as to whether the Zeus is being replaced or if this is going to be an extra option in the range. The Poseidon's going to come in at $435 US, which is about $85 US more than the Zeus. But at the time of this launch, there'll be an early bird special running. So if you jump through the links below, you're going to be able to pick up the Poseidon as part of the early bird orders for $279 initially, and then $299 for the second wave of early birds, before it moves apparently into its $435 US permanent retail price. At least that's the information I've been provided by Linsol, so I assume that's the progression it's going to take. To be really clear, there's no affiliates or kickbacks. I get nothing from any orders you place using the links below. It's just a way of saying thank you, and for me, I really wanted to give you a chance to jump in on this headphone early, get those great prices if you think it's a headphone that suits you. And so to help you decide that, let's talk about the Poseidon.
And I'm back to a place that I left a long time ago. Just give me a sec while I smoke this cigarette. My aching body feels better still. What do you do?
The most obvious thing to mention, of course, given that you'll be able to see it on my desk here, is the case that these come in. This is probably the best example of headphone packaging I've seen, short of the Meza Empyreans and the Meza Elites. And by the way, I do have a review of the Elite coming soon, so make sure you subscribe if you want to see that one. But this is second only to the Meza headphones in terms of packaging, and given that you're only paying $435 US for these, as opposed to thousands of US dollars for the Mezas, this is really impressive. Interestingly, the case here for the Poseidon is also a little bit smaller than the case for the Zeus. So that's a nice bonus that you get a smaller case, but still a beautiful case for the headphones. If I open the case up now, you can quickly see that the headphone comes beautifully packaged. Now the cable is better managed when you first receive it. It's in a lovely little velvet bag. It's got protectors over each of the various connectors. It's very, very nicely delivered. But more important than that is the headphones themselves. Those of you familiar with the Zeus will already know the general aesthetic of these. Nothing has changed in terms of the design. It's still a stainless steel headband with wooden inserts. It's got this interesting mechanism where the separation happens up the top here. It's unusual. I don't mind it. I don't particularly like it, but I don't dislike it. It's just a different approach. The good thing is there's plenty of extension, as you may have just seen. It does allow for a fairly large head size. Probably the biggest difference that you'll have noticed if you're familiar with the Zeus is the colour scheme change. Gone is the fairly Art Deco look of the walnut and silver from the Zeus, and instead we've now got an interesting kind of design with black and maple. Now, whether or not this is better, that's going to be very much personal. I actually quite like the look of the Zeus. I think it's got a really interesting kind of old worldy look to it, whereas this is a little bit more modern, but also probably a bit less striking in terms of not being able to see as much of the detail in the grille. Some might like that, some might not. I'll leave it up to you to decide. Other than that, in terms of the physical build, not much has changed. I'll talk about the driver in a second, but before we get there, everything else is much the same. So you've got the same swiveling options with the cups. You've got a nice large round opening with a veloury, suede microfiber type pad. And then on the bottom, we've got a pair of 3.5mm inputs. And that's great news because more and more headphones are offering 3.5mm. All of the hi-fi men range now, both the Zeus and the Poseidon have that. So it's becoming a very ubiquitous connection. And that means that any of the cables that you might have for any of your other headphones with 3.5 will also fit the Poseidon here. Having said that, they do come with a really lovely cable. So what you get in the box is this nice cloth wrapped cable. It's got rubber in the section after it splits here up to the 3.5mm connectors I just mentioned, but the rest of it is cloth wrapped and it ends in kind of an old school XLR connector, but a nice solid metal one. To go with that, you also get a 6.3 to XLR adapter. So it's really fully featured in that sense. You've got balanced and single-ended, everything you could need. It was a bit of a surprise to me to see them not go with the 4.4mm out of the Zeus behind me here, instead going to the 4-pin XLR. I'm sure there's a reason for that, I'm not clear on what it was. But the point being, I don't think it's the end of the world either way, whether it's 4-pin XLR or 4.4mm, as long as it's balanced to start with. So that's fantastic. You've got a nice quality cable. It's a slightly better cable in my opinion than the Zeus. It has a little bit less memory of shape. So you'll see as I undo it, it's still got a little bit of kind of kinking in memory, but it's not as strong to do that as the Zeus cable was. That's probably my one drawback on the Zeus cable, is that it was a little bit prone to that kind of kinking and holding the bends from how it was rolled up. So far we've got a fantastic headphone in terms of the look of it. It feels really nicely made. It's all powder coated, so it's going to last well, as long as you don't bang it around too hard. It's got this nice maple wood finish. It's a very high gloss, which some are going to like. It does make it look like it could be fake, but apparently it's not, so I'm going to take their word on that one. All in all, it's a really nicely looking and made headphone at the price range. Before I talk about some of the details to do with sound and tuning, let's talk about what's producing that sound inside the cups here. On the inside of the Poseidon is a nickel-coated diaphragm. So this has got a nickel-coated, and it's apparently solid pure nickel coating on the diaphragm instead of the beryllium used on the Zeus. HarmonicDyne have gone to great lengths talking about why nickel is a better choice than beryllium, and what they're citing is that it's denser and it's also more rigid. So in some ways that sounds great, but it does also mean that it's going to be a heavier driver potentially unless they've used less nickel. Now when it comes to designing drivers, as I understand it, and I'm no expert in the field, but as I understand it, you're always going to be trading off between the weight of the driver, the rigidity of the driver, the harmonic resonances of the driver, because every material has its own ability to produce different resonances. So it's always going to be a trade-off. So as much as I do believe that the sound quality from the Poseidon is an upgrade over the Zeus, as I'll talk about soon, I also don't know that it's necessarily proof that nickel is in all cases better than beryllium. I think there's always going to be trade-offs to be made, and on this occasion, the nickel sounds great. The driver used seems to be quite similar in many other ways to what was in the Zeus, because it's still a 64-ohm driver, although it's actually slightly more sensitive, moving from a 100 decibel sensitivity to a 103 decibel sensitivity. Now in reality, that doesn't mean very much because you can drive these to dangerous listening levels with only 6 to 10 milliwatts. So in either case, they're very easy to drive. The sensitivity isn't something you should worry about, but I did think it was interesting that there has been a slight change there. The final thing that I'll mention before we start talking about some of the marketing, what you should expect, and how they sound, the final thing before that I want to talk about is that the Poseidon, just like the Zeus, use a strongly angled driver. So when you look inside the headphone cup, the driver is a little bit forward and quite tilted back towards the ears. And that's a big part of how they produce the sound they do, which, much like the Zeus, is spacious and open sounding, despite an unusual and what you might think of as a fairly warm and thick tuning. The spatial representation from the Poseidon is even better than the Zeus, and that's part of what the Zeus was known for. So we will get to that shortly, but I wanted to call out the fact that the physical design, the placement of the driver, all of that is the same. It seems to me the only things changing is the use of the different timber, this time being maple instead of walnut, and also the material used to coat the driver itself. Beyond that, everything else is looking pretty similar. And so now let's talk about some of the marketing. When I read through the marketing page for the Poseidons as part of my research for these, there were lots and lots of bold claims. And I want to quickly share some of those quotes, some of those claims with you, and also my reactions to them, having heard and tested the Poseidons for myself. Now I want to be very clear here, none of what I'm about to say should cause you to turn off the video and go away from thinking about buying these, but it is worth knowing what reality looks like versus what the marketing says. So let's take a look at some of the claims. Not really, no. Just because a headphone can hit 10 Hz doesn't mean it's producing it at the same level as other frequencies. So yes, technically this might be able to produce 10 Hz, but it's way, way, way quieter than the rest of the frequency response, and therefore you're not going to hear subwoofer type sound from the Poseidon. This is only partially true. The sound from the Poseidon is very, very kind of spacious. There is a great sense of clarity and transparency, but it's not at all a natural or neutral sound. This is a coloured headphone, unashamedly so. It sounds great, but don't expect a reference-like performance from this. I don't think you will ever find a studio anywhere in the world that sounds anything like these do. And that's not a knock against the headphone. They do what they do very well, but the marketing is really misleading on this point. And so what you can probably tell here is that this is not a headphone you should buy based on the marketing. The marketing is a bit overly creative in my opinion. They've stretched the truth a little bit too far. And so for me, what I feel is important is to try to give you an accurate representation of what to expect if you do buy the Poseidons. And so let's talk now about their sound quality. And I did this a bit differently. Normally when I test the sound quality for a headphone, I put on my specific test tracks in a specific order and I work my way through. But on this occasion, the headphone is quite uniquely tuned, as I've already mentioned, and so I was curious to see just what stood out to me when, as I listened to a range of different test tracks. And the first thing that really clearly hits you when you put on a pair of Poseidons is their sense of space and imaging. They do a great job at producing this wonderful, spacious soundstage with a pretty good focus on the imaging. It's probably not quite HD800 levels, but it's going to be getting close to it. And I mean that in terms of space. I think in terms of image focus, an HD800 is probably a bit sharper in terms of the focus. But for the price, once again, $435 US, the Poseidon is doing a fantastic job. At the early bird prices of $279 or $299, it's absolutely killer. So staging and space is great. I also found clarity to be quite shockingly good from these, and I mean that because they are a warm, rich sounding headphone. But similar to the Beyerdynamic T5 3rd generation, which I reviewed here and loved and bought myself a pair, these have that same sort of trick of being rich and warm, and yet somehow still having this beautiful sense of clarity in the notes. So you can hear lots of information, lots of details, it's well separated, and yet it's still rich and lush and warm. So it's a pretty cool trick. It's not going to be to everyone's taste, but for those that like a rich, warm sound, these once again do it beautifully. Overall, the sound from these is warm and smooth. It's lush, but somehow it's not too thick. Probably I'd call them creamy sounding in some ways. So they've got that slightly thicker than neutral, definitely much warmer than neutral sound, and yet they do it in a way that it never sounds overly sluggish or slow. There is a little bit of a sense of a veil in some of the upper mids. Things could be a little bit too sucked out there for some people, but it's a really enjoyable tuning, albeit a very different one. And it's headphones like this that are one of the reasons I don't tend to use EQ. And again, I'm not knocking people who do use EQ, I'm just sharing my perspective on it. These are a target curve that I would never ever think of if I was going to EQ something. and yet somehow they just work. And so instead what I find by not using EQ is that I get to enjoy a very different presentation when I put on the Poseidons. Rather than being Harmon target or trying to be ruler flat or anything like that, they've just thrown out the rulebook, done something different, and it works really well. It's a fun and interesting listen. Sometimes vocals can come off lacking a little bit of texture, particularly female vocals where you want a little bit more air and texture in those upper registers. So it can be a little bit imperfect in that regard, but at the same time, it's very enjoyable at what it's doing. So it's a trade-off that I'm happy to make, but I wanted to make sure it was clear to you that they do have shortcomings. That is something for those of you that like EQing that easily could be fixed with EQ. It's not a lack of technicalities by the driver, it's just a side effect of that rich warm tuning. Something else that's worth noting here is that with the tuning the way it is, the bass is very present and strong in the mid bass, but it does roll off super fast. So as I said before, that 10Hz claim from HarmonicDyne is really a bit of a stretch. I have no doubt they can produce 10Hz, but I also have no doubt that you're actually not going to hear the 10Hz because it's way lower than that mid-bass hump. And even 20Hz and 30Hz are quite a long way down. So these don't have the extension and the deep rumble that you might want from a headphone that's bassy, but they kind of make up for it in most cases by having that extra lift in the bass through the mid-bass range. And so I'm not going to for a second complain about the bass, but I did want to put it in perspective. These are a bass that's fantastic for normal kind of acoustic bass representations. They're going to be great in hip-hop, blues, rock, jazz. If you've got a double bass, they're going to pick that up really nicely, but they're not going to do as well for those of you listening to, say, electronic music if you really want that deep extension to the bass. The final thing I should mention before we get into some comparisons for these is that whilst the soundstage is very spacious and quite wide, it doesn't have huge amounts of depth, and I think that's coming down to some of the high-end response from these and the way it's going to be masked a little bit by the bass. And so I'd say they're good in sound staging, and at their price I'd almost probably say they're excellent, but they're not quite up there with the best of the best, even though they're exceptional with their width and their general space. And so to sum up the sound quality for these, you've probably already got the sense that they're a bit unique, they've got definite coloration, they're rich, they're warm, they're creamy, and that sort of emphasis has an interesting side effect, which is that they can suit some genres really well and others not quite as much. As I mentioned before, female vocals on these, depending on the recording, can be a little bit hit and miss. They're never bad, sometimes though they're just not quite as good as everything else sounds. Another thing with emphasis like this is that they can get not exactly picky with the source, but it is important to know that their emphasis will play better and worse with some sources. What I found was that these sounded better working with something like the Sparkos Labs Aries or even the X-Duo MT604 rather than the very neutral TT2. The TT2 has a little bit of dryness in the upper mids that at times wasn't a particularly good fit with the Poseidon, whereas the Aries from Sparkos Labs, while still being very neutral and very clean, just has a slightly smoother and fuller sense in the upper mids that I found preferable with the Poseidon. So do be aware of that. They are a headphone that for me, because of that emphasis, is going to improve with some devices. It's never going to get bad. It's not like an HD800 where it's going to get really nasty with the wrong choice. It's just going to get better with the right choice and be fine with everything else. So do keep that in mind. If you do pick up a pair of these, try them on a few different sources and see what you like best. For now though, let's start talking comparisons to really put these in perspective. And I'm going to start with the obvious comparison here with the HarmonicDyne Zeus. I got the Zeus here about a week or so ahead of the Poseidon, and I must admit I really liked these before the Poseidon came along, which is not to say I don't still like them, but the Poseidon are clearly a step above these. Now on that note, it would be great if you can let me know in the comments down below if you want me to do a full and thorough review of these, or if the comparison I'm about to give you is enough for everybody. So if you do want to know more about the Zeus, make sure you drop a comment down below and let me know. One of the tracks I used when comparing these two was These Days by the Foo Fighters. Starting off with the Poseidon on that track before I even listened to the Zeus, it was really clear that the Poseidon is a thick and warm and rich headphone. Like I said, it doesn't go too warm for my taste at least. I really like what it's doing, but it's definitely not a neutral sound. It's actually a really interesting mixture of sounds because the drums and the guitar came across with a good sense of attack and punch on the Poseidons, and yet at times the track also came across just a little bit too rich and full for what I would consider to be a fairly natural presentation. It was just enough that it did get a bit distracting at times. When Dave Grohl rips into the chorus though, the Poseidons provide all of the gravel and the edge to the sound that's needed to convey the energy he's put into it. So they're not hiding anything from you, you're not losing anything in terms of that attack and that energy in things like guitars or those rough vocals from Dave Grohl in the chorus, but at the same time, the bass from these, that mid-bass hump, did occasionally just kind of overshadow some of the more subtle details that I would have liked to hear a bit better. It's minor, but there is a bit of trade-off going on. Flipping over to the Zeus, I heard a very, very similar experience. The bass wasn't audibly much different, they sounded fairly indistinguishable. I think if you gave me a blind test with these, I wouldn't know which one I was listening to in terms of the bass. But when it came to the treble, the Zeus has a much grainier style treble. It's a little bit harsher through the treble, which gives it a bit more bite and a bit more attack, but for me, it actually goes a bit too far and gets a little bit harsh and grainy when compared to the very cleanly delivered treble from the Poseidon. For me, the Zeus comes across as a warm headphone that can get a bit fatiguing, whilst the Poseidon comes across as a warm headphone that's still got that treble peak to provide detail, but does it in a much more refined way. And I don't mean more rolled off, I mean all the same detail is there, it's just better delivered. I also listened to some of the Skyrim soundtrack while I was comparing these two, just to give me a completely different flavour of music, and I found that the Poseidon provided a much greater sense of space and clarity in the sound compared to the Zeus. And the Zeus isn't bad in that respect, but the Poseidon is clearly a significant step better. Going between the two, the Zeus actually sounds muffled and veiled in comparison to the Poseidon. So as I said, the Zeus isn't bad, but for just $85 more, the Poseidon is a significant upgrade. And if you can pick it up again at that $279 or $299 early bird price, this headphone is a steal if you like a rich warm sound. It's a headphone that to me makes a lot of sense if you're looking for something different from anything else. I haven't heard any other open back headphone that does things like the Poseidon does. So if you had yourself an HD650, HD6XX, maybe some Beyerdynamics, maybe some of the Hi-Foman range, any other headphone I can think of, nothing does what the Poseidon or the Zeus do, and the Poseidon does it better than the Zeus. So this is a fantastic headphone for a different option and a bit of coloration in your life. But before we wrap things up there, let me give you a couple of other comparisons where you might be sitting on the fence looking at other options. One of the other headphones I thought about when I was reviewing these was the Sivga P2. The reason I thought of this was it sits in a fairly similar price range at about $400 US. It's also made of wood. These are a beautifully made headphone. I think aesthetically, they're probably on par, if not slightly better, than the Poseidon and the Zeus. But they're a planar magnetic headphone with a fairly different tuning. So I thought it would be interesting to see how these compared to the Poseidons and see if these might be a better option for some people. While comparing these two, one of the tracks that came on was Sarah by Kate Miller-Heidke. Listening to that track on the P2 comes across definitely as being a more neutral sounding headphone. There's a better sense of detail retrieval, particularly through the mids and upper mids, and it's definitely much less coloured overall. On the other hand though, the soundstage suddenly feels very small compared to the relatively huge Poseidon soundstage. So each of them is a very different headphone with very different strengths and weaknesses. I feel like the P2 does a better job through the lighter, more delicate parts of the track, but then when things get going, when there's that big bass drum hit coming in, the drama of the track gets going, I felt like the P2 left me a little bit cold. And that's where the Poseidon, on the other hand, kicked off and really took a hold of the music. So they're both very different presentations. If you were looking for a headphone that's more neutral, that maybe you could do some editing or mixing with, the P2 would definitely be the choice out of these two. But if you're looking for one that's just pure emotional enjoyment of music, I do think the Poseidon wins out. There's no doubt for me that in that sort of $300 to $500 price range, these are two of the most attractive and probably best made headphones I've come across, with some beautiful finishing as well. and so both can be great choices, but it would depend on whether you want a slightly more neutral, albeit not purely neutral, but a more neutral sound, or whether you want that emotion and drama and coloration that the Poseidons bring. So I'll leave that one with you to have a think about which makes more sense to you while we turn to our next comparison with the Hi-Fi and Sundara. I brought the Sundara into the mix here because it's such a reference point for so many people. Now my version of the Sundara I believe is not the most recent. I also don't know if there's any significant sonic changes from the recent version. So think of this as like a 2019-ish model Sundara. I did buy it secondhand, so I'm not 100% sure the exact build date of this one, but as I understand it, it's almost the most recent, but not the most recent version. The Sundaras generally retail for about $350 even though their list price is $499. So they're a cheaper headphone than the Poseidon at their actual street price, but I do think they're a headphone that many people might consider while they're thinking of the Poseidon as well. The track that I chose to share with you for this comparison was She's Too Good For Me by Sting. On this track I started with the Sundara before I went to the Poseidon, and it immediately reminded me just what a good headphone it is. These are a brilliant, brilliant headphone. The Sundaras were completely at home on everything from the orchestral backed bridge in this track, right through into the driving, rhythmic choruses. They just handled everything beautifully. Probably the only thing I could complain about from the Sundara was that I would have liked just a little bit of a deeper sense of bass from them, but it's a very minor complaint. Flipping over to the Poseidon, that sense of space once again kicks in, and they're bigger and broader sounding than the Sundaras. They also gave me a better sense of that punch in the bass. They definitely hit harder than the Sundara, but they're also lacking that last little bit of extension that I wished I had. I feel like individual notes were focused slightly better by the Poseidon, so the sense of space was bigger, and also the focusing of the individual parts of the image were a little bit better on the Poseidon, but both of them are fairly strong in terms of image focus. So it's probably more that the space in the Poseidon soundstage allows more separation, and therefore things seem a bit more focused. So in many ways they were kind of going neck and neck, and that continued into the upper mids and the treble details as well. I feel like the Poseidon, after listening to the Sundara, comes across just a little bit veiled in the upper mids. Things sounded like they could have just done with a 1 or 2 dB boost in some of those presence regions of vocals and the like. But on the flip side of that, the treble from the Sundara was lacking a little bit in extension after hearing the Poseidon. So again, it's a little bit of a trade-off and a question of what you're looking for. The Sundara, much like the Sivga P2, is again closer to neutral than the Poseidon is. The Poseidon, once again, is that rich, coloured, deliberately fun and emotional experience, so it's really going to depend on what you're looking for in a headphone. If you could only buy one headphone that had to do everything for you, then I would probably say that the Sundara or the P2 are probably the better choices. But if you're looking for a secondary headphone in your collection, you've maybe got something that's a bit more neutral, a bit more do-it-all, and you want some fun, you want some excitement, the Poseidon are absolutely brilliant. I think at $435, they're still a very solid option. Their performance, their sense of clarity and space is very, very strong. They are clearly coloured, they're clearly rich, so you do need to know what you're buying when you get them, but the combination of build quality, the aesthetics, the packaging, including the cable that you get with them, everything about them screams quality and longevity, and then they're doing the tuning that they have about as well as anything I've heard short of the $1,000 T5 3rd Gen from Beyerdynamic. And that's also a closed headphone, so a very different experience. So if you're in the market for some fun, you want a unique looking headphone that's a bit different from the run-of-the-mill and is going to give you a different flavour than any other headphone you're likely to buy, I do think the Poseidon's worth a go. Go into it with your eyes open, knowing the coloration that you're buying, but embrace that coloration, enjoy the fun that it can bring to your music. If you're able to click on that link and grab an early bird offer at $279 or $299, this is one of the best headphones you're likely to buy under $300. There might be a couple of others floating around that come close, but there's not many that I think can clearly and easily say they are better. At $435, competition does get a bit tighter, but I still think the Poseidons hold their own because of their unique tuning and their unique look. So if this sounds good to you, make sure you use the link below to go through and get in on the early bird pricing. As a reminder, I'm not encouraging you to do that because there's any kickbacks from the link. I'm just trying to make it easy for you. This is just a way of saying thank you to Linsol for sending these out, and also to make sure that you know about this headphone as quickly as possible. If you've reached this point and this doesn't sound like a headphone for you, then do remember I've got reviews of the Sundara, the P2, and a whole lot of other headphones on the channel, so make sure you check out other options I've got here, and also make sure you hit that subscribe button. I've got a heap of other content coming with some really interesting headphones and other devices too. If you found this review useful, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe and like. It really helps the channel out and helps me to keep bringing content like this to you, helping retailers and manufacturers to want to send me gear to share with you. But for now, I'll leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.